Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for yet another Diplomat webinar. We are very excited today because the social credit system may be one of the most talked about but least understood topics in China today, and there's no shortage of topics like that, unfortunately. Almost everyone who is interested in China has heard about the social credit system, but few people actually understand what it is or how it functions. So we're very fortunate to have three experts with us today who do understand it very well, and they can clear up some of the prevailing myths about it and help us all understand it much better. Where the social credit system is going, what it is today, and what obstacles still remain. Excuse me, a little bit of a cough. So Jeremy Daum is joining us from the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale, where he's a senior research scholar in law and a senior fellow. You may also know him as the founder and contributing editor of the collaborative translation and commentary site China Law Translate, which is an invaluable resource for anyone interested in China's legal system. I myself use it quite often. So thank you, Jeremy, for starting that for us.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Dai Xin, who is an associate professor of legal theory at Peking University Law School, where he researches law and society, information privacy, and internet law, among other topics. And he has conducted award-winning research into the social credit system. So we're very happy to have Professor Dai joining us today. And we are, last but not least, joined by Vincent Brussee, an associate analyst at MERICS in Berlin, Germany, where his research focuses on the social credit system, digital media, and cyber governance. And he's the co-author of the recent report, China's Social Credit System in 2021, From Fragmentation Toward Integration. So thank you, Vincent, for joining us. And Jeremy is going to start us off by talking about what the social credit system is, and just as importantly, what it isn't, by tackling some of the most common misunderstandings and myths that you may have seen in the Western media. So Jeremy, take it away.
Thanks, Shannon. I've spent a lot of time over the last several years doing this sort of myth busting of social credit. And what I've found is that in discussing it, it's really hard to find a starting place because the media coverage has so diverged from what's actually happening in China that when I start to myth bust, people eventually just sort of look at me and say, are you saying there is no social credit system? No, there is a social credit system. It's just very different than what you've heard about. It's now the Western media has created a system that is really only tangentially related to what social credit actually is in China. So what we hear about in what I call the social credit fanfic, which is the media coverage that really just goes off on its own. We get a dystopian scenario, something about algorithmic reputation scoring mechanisms based on real-time monitoring through big data tools, generating a score that, as Vice President Pence said, controls virtually every facet of human life, or as Wired magazine once said, dictates one's place in society. The reality of social credit is both more complicated and far less exciting. There's a lot of dystopian activity going on in China and in the world these days, but this particular fantasy about social credit does not really align with reality. Citizens in China do not really all have a social credit score, either now or as the system has been designed and says it's going to. So where does all this mythos come from? I've argued that the idea of this scoring mechanism gets so much traction and has become so popular because it resonates with a more global fear of emerging information technologies. That could be in terms of surveillance by governments or corporations, in terms of targeted content and personalized data. And of course, we're facing a global misinformation crisis. Information technology is new. Our societies aren't really ready for it. And I think that one of the things we've done is we hold up China, or a largely imagined China, as a sort of worst case scenario to either use as an example of what we should be working to prevent, or to take some sort of cold comfort from it being worse somewhere than it is wherever you might be. So ironically, I think that the real dystopian story would be a misinformation story here with social credit. And it's what's most interesting to me about social credit at this point is the spread of this mythos about it. It's amazing because anyone who went to China and talked to someone on the street would quickly realize they've been woefully misinformed. Although I've had reporters who've traveled to sites that were supposed to have advanced models of social credit and tell me things like, clearly it's not really happening, but I'm afraid to say that because I'll be branded an apologist. So we now have the misinformation story overwhelming reality, even when a reporter sees it. I have tracked the origin through some popular media stories. We could go into that later. But the key thing to realize is that in the earliest stories that created this real mythos, it's almost always holding up the imagined Chinese social credit system to say something about the rest of the world. It's very rarely in a story about China. It's always, look, this could come to you. This could happen here. And it was a way of looking at us from the very beginning. Now, the actual social credit system in China is much more complicated because unlike good science fiction, it has to be practical, possible, and useful. Also, it's an evolving system and keeps changing, including the concept of what it is and how it's supposed to play out. And it's changed quite a bit since the original origins. So when talking about what China's social credit system actually is, I do always start in talking about what it isn't. And in addition to the mythos, I want to separate parts of things that are happening in China that are things we could talk about, like police surveillance, that are separate from social credit or adjacent to it at least. And I think this is important because when I'm talking about social credit, I'm really talking about China's social credit system, which is a unique policy or system. And I don't want people to think that I'm saying there aren't other things happening in China with surveillance, because we do know cameras are ubiquitous, predictive policing models are moving forward, et cetera. So the first thing I say is that social credit isn't focused on rating citizens. Its primary emphasis is on corporations or businesses, organizations. Citizens aren't the focus, although there is a component that deals with them. It isn't focused on rating, I say, because if you look at the original planning documents and what's come after, scores, to the extent they exist in local governments, are at best a small component of it. It isn't actually tech heavy. The social credit system right now, while we use it to discuss big issues of information technology that are coming forward, the actual system is more of just a record. It's a record of violations of laws or legal obligations. And even within that, what information can be made public, what information is recorded, has been increasingly tightly regulated. So what is social credit? Well, like I said, it's complicated and the idea has evolved, but I've broken it down into three main components. And the first is a financial component. And this is why you see the People's Bank of China involved in the drafting of the social credits, because there is a financial end. And this is familiar to most people, because it's just a credit score similar to others. Actually, sorry, I said score, which is not true. In fact, most Chinese credit reports don't even involve a score when you order them, although the banks have begun offering a numeric score as an extra feature, but usually it's just a record of lending and spending. And each of these areas, like financial, publicity, education, and regulatory, that are part of social credit, uses its own terminology. For financial, that's Zhengxin, which is credit reporting. The second area is a publicity education, and this is what got people's attention, I think, originally, is there's this idea that it's going to help bring chengxin, integrity or credit worthiness. I call this mainly a publicity or propaganda campaign, because while this part is aimed at individuals and the idea is fostering a sense of trustworthiness in the people, this term is chengxin is one of the core socialist values campaign, trying to create a moral foundation for the people of China. And there are teeth to this component. The punishments in social credit all relate to violations of law that have a legal basis otherwise. And so this is where scores do fit in at local governments, but these scores can officially not have any punishments based on them. The main area of social credit, which you're going to hear about from my colleagues here, I suspect, is the regulatory component. And this is the main area of it, and it is aimed at corporations and run by various regulatory agencies. And it's where we hear about blacklists and things like this. And this area is the part that I say we would have saved a lot of confusion if instead of calling it the social credit system, we just called it the laws on the collection and use of administrative enforcement data. This is generally what it is. These agencies, in the course of enforcing administrative laws like food safety, drug safety, sometimes give penalties, sometimes give warnings. They create records of these. When they're more serious, they can blacklist an agency, which may blacklist an organization, which may have consequences through MOUs with other agencies that result in punishments even outside of their administrative area. For the sake of time, I just want to point out that those punishments do tend to be very limited in focus. We tend to hear about this controlling every aspect of your life. But in fact, the punishments that come with social credit through these MOUs, in addition to normal administrative penalties, are things the government has the power to do. Higher scrutiny or restrictions in authorizing permits, credentials, or approvals. Higher scrutiny and restrictions in participating in government contract bidding. Restrictions on receiving official awards. Increased routine oversight. Limits on receiving government benefits. So basically, each agency is already limited in its legal authority, especially when it's taking action against somebody because they're on a blacklist by another agency. And for anyone who's worked in government or had interactions with government, you know that government agencies don't always play well together. So they are quite limited in the way this goes, with the exception of one major blacklist from the courts. I see that I am going quickly over 10 minutes, but I will say that there's a special list of court judgment defaulters that we have to mention, which is where a lot of the mythos comes from. And that's because the courts, which had the power to do so before, impose restrictions on individuals and organizations that are more restrictive, like no-fly lists, no-train lists. And this is for people who have an active court judgment against them, have the ability to perform on it, and have not done so. And I'll stop there because I know we want to have time for everybody to speak, and we could go quite a long time into any of these components.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeremy. As you said, it's always hard to jump into the social credit system because there is a lot going on, both in what it is and what it isn't. But thank you for that very detailed overview. And Xin, we're going to turn to you next. We heard a lot from Jeremy about Western misperceptions of the social credit system. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about views about the social credit system within China and debates about it within China, and maybe even misperceptions about what it is within China itself, because we don't hear as much about that aspect of things in other countries.
Sure. Thanks, Shannon, for having me. So I think some of this actually, I think Jeremy mentioned. So if I'm going to talk about the perception of people about what's a social credit system within China, so I'd say so the general public actually continues to remain largely unaware of what impact all of this may actually have on their daily lives. I mean, especially those people, the individual citizens who are not business people, right? So we're going to talk about business people separately. So for just the rest of us, they don't. So most of us, most of the people actually are not aware, the existence of this, social credit system at all. So right, so. Which I think is actually rational because actually it really doesn't affect their lives so much, at least at this point, right? So if you go on the street and ask for example, people, do you know your social credit score, for example, right? So I guess there might be three types of reaction, right? So first type of reaction will be, what score, right? Do I have one, right? So the second type of reaction might be, oh, do you, by social credit score, do you mean the score, the Sesame credit score by Alipay or Tencent score, by Tencent, right? So that those are the relatively, tech savvy people or use, smartphone more than others. But technically speaking, or strictly legal speaking, those scores are not credit score at all. And they're more like, in the nature of platform, point programs, at least at this point, right? So the third type of reaction might be, oh, I have heard about this kind of score because I live in this limited number of cities. For example, Hangzhou, Suzhou, Xiamen, they do have these kind of programs, as Jeremy mentioned, right? The local government actually have piloted this kind of individual citizen score. But those scores, people, not a lot of people actually care to sign up. So these scores, you have to voluntarily sign up for it so that you can have it. Otherwise, you don't have the score. And people don't necessarily care about signing up because they're not seeing any meaningful incentives, right? So the most incentive would be the trivial kind of benefits like reduce public transportation fares if you have a good score, right? So, but otherwise, as Jeremy mentioned, officially, the government can't tie anything negative to these scores, at least at this point, right? So the social credit, system, so a lot of times government, I do see a lot of government tout by far, a very big achievement that of the social credit system in terms of impairing, affecting or improving people's life, are in the sense that they say, look, now for average, citizens, it has become much easier for people to process their government-related stuff, government-related, works online or all from their smartphone, right? So that people no longer need to carry all kinds of paperwork, paper materials as proof to get your government license or other kind of government process. So, but then you understand, right? So that's officially included as part of what social credit system has achieved, but that's really digitized government, right? So that's digitization of government process or reduction of paperwork, right? So that actually tells a lot about what the social credit system actually has done by far, right? So that's for the average individual citizens. What about the business people? Well, the business people do care about social credit system and also the evaluation kind of related social credit system, right? So they care about the social credit system or many of the mechanism or the regulations because they care about two things, right? One, they care about their ability to continue to borrow money to have financing. Second, they do care about their status of regulatory compliance or the consequences of non-compliance, for example. So they care about social credit system from those two aspect, and that's exactly what Jeremy said, right? Besides the publicity or propaganda part component, the primary component of the social credit system are really one is the financing, and then the other is the regulatory. I do want to add one about the financing though, right? So yes, indeed, the central bank, the PBOC, People's Bank of China, they do have run and operated, a traditional or orthodox credit reporting system for many years, many decades already. The reason why, now, so we are having this separate social credit system is because, or at least the larger social credit system, which the central bank system might only be part of it, is one of this because people are trying to explore the use of government data as alternative credit data, right? So the government data, many of the data that stored in government system, they traditionally are not used for bank lending or borrowing purposes, but for the purpose of expanding access to credit lines, to, for example, servicing, small and medium enterprises or sometimes consumers, right? In some cases. So that's why they're thinking, oh, we also have all these other data. If you, as a borrower, doesn't have a record in the traditional bank credit reporting system, maybe we will be able to look into all these other data so as to serve the basis of giving you money, right? So that's the part of it. So I will talk briefly about 3 lines of debates currently within China about a social credit system, which I observe might be of interest, right? The first line of debate, I think, is relatively superficial, and also those are very somehow similar to what's going on among, for example, foreign media or sometimes foreign scholars. Actually, unfortunately, I have been peer reviewing some papers written by apparently academics talking about China's social credit score, for a whole paper, which actually is something that doesn't exist, right? So, but then still, this kind of talks also exist among Chinese scholars, so which is unfortunate because there are also people within China who might know as little about what's going on as people outside, right? So they talk about, for example, the surveillance issue, the abuse of power issue, and also they say maybe, oh, some of the credit-based sanction might be too punitive. And that's they thought they mistaken many of these things as created anew by the social credit system, which actually many of the sanctions or many of the consequences already existed before, right? So that's the first line of debate. The second line of a debate about social credit systems are more sophisticated, right? So those are about how to better design the whole thing as they operate, right? For example, people have been discussing, okay, so when you have this business regulation component of the system, you want to know, for example, if a firm that gets a bad entry, whether this firm might have a chance to correct it if it happens to be an erroneous piece of information. If so, how do you set up the mechanism for doing that kind of correction? Or even if your bad record reflects correctly on what you have done wrong, then maybe people thought about, should we give these kind of corporations a way or an opportunity, second chance, right, to make some amends or fulfill some requirements so as to get your bad sort of credit evaluation change, or we call repaired, right? So these kind of things, there are a lot of these kind of discussion, debate. People have different ideas how to set these kind of things up, right? So that's a very hard questions sometimes involved, right, about mechanism design, right? So the third line of debate, I would say, is more structural, right? So these years, I think there are people debating about whether the social credit system project as a whole should be actually broken up into two parts, right? So exactly corresponding to the two parts that we have talked about, including what Jeremy mentioned, right? So maybe they say we should have two systems. One system focuses on the work of collecting and processing alternative credit data to supplement the the traditional credit reporting system operated by the central bank, right? So and then you should, so they say that should be one part. Then the other part should be actually separated, which should be focused on using data, using government data and records for regulatory purposes to support better enforcement of existing regulations, right? So this separation argument has generally been made by people working within the financial sector, especially many of them are either currently or mostly actually formerly affiliated with the central bank, right? So their view is actually now, okay, we already know how to do the financial credit system very well. We have this system already, and we know how to use the data, run the system, police the have the protocol for data privacy and security. Okay, and so the only thing we need to do is to, okay, the governments, you should open up your data trove, send everything useful to us so we can actually have a better or more powerful credit system. But don't even think about we support you for the regulatory stuff, right? So, and of course you have people on the other side thinking, no. So we're actually having this one integrated, interlinked, larger infrastructure which can be used for multiple purposes, right? Not just for lending. So that's another line of discussion happening right now. I'm gonna stop here, and also we can talk more during the Q&A.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if it's encouraging or disheartening to hear that people in China are misunderstanding this just as much as we are outside of China, but it's interesting to know that that is happening. Okay, Vincent is going to close off our panelist discussion by talking about where the social credit system is going. So where it is now versus where the authorities would like to take it in the future, and how they're actually going to get there. So Vincent, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And before doing so, I really once again have to touch on some of these really pervasive, as Jeremy already called it, fanfics. Because even like after having this discussion many times, you still see this notion of social credit score just pop up relentlessly. And it's a beautiful myth, actually, this idea that there's this well-oiled machine that uses some kind of higher level algorithm that us mere humans cannot even begin to understand, and then spits out basically scores and blacklists in whatever magical way. And of course, the reality is much more sobering. And I want to touch on three things. Very briefly, hopefully, really touching on what is it now? What are some of its defining features in all of this complexity? Secondly, what does this really entail? What are the risks associated for businesses, individuals, but also foreign entities that are operating out of China? And lastly, then really, what is the path forward? So I would like to pick out 3 points from this recent report that we wrote together with my colleague Katja Drienhausen. And the first is, you probably already caught on from both previous talks that the social credit system is incredibly messy. And we often refer to it as a regulatory jungle. There are thousands of documents that refer to credit or social credit in one way or another. And what is understood as social credit covers so many different facets that even for many Chinese policymakers, it is not exactly clear what direction to go in. So although we see a general move towards one direction, the exact interpretation and exact implementation really varies from region to region. So if I would go into all of those, that is of course really a lot of time. But really the most important thing, therefore, to note is that instead of there being this one super social credit system, it is more a loose-hanging policy framework of different social credit systems. So different cities or different ministries or different departments may evaluate what is considered untrustworthy behavior and what is trustworthy behavior. What are red lists and how do we implement them? They work with these different things in different types of ways. And in the process, they may also focus on very specific aspects of that broad social credit. So they may, for instance, focus on debt repayment. So the court order defaulter blacklist that Jeremy Daum already illustrated. Or they may focus on food safety violations. And in the process, some of these other aspects, they remain a bit by the bylines. And what this has created is this really fragmented ecosystem where data islands have emerged. So the idea that these systems simply do not operate together very well because they do things so differently. And that really also then ties into the second point. And Jeremy Daum already very briefly mentioned it, so I'll also go quickly over this. And that is low tech. Really, it is often envisioned, both in China, it is surrounded by sometimes these buzzwords like big data, like AI. But in reality, one of the main purposes of the social credit system was only to take all of that data, all of these government forms, all of these red stamp documents that have been collecting dust in filing cabinets and take those online to make sure that, again, on this regulatory element, that if there was a violation of food safety in one area, that a company could not simply move to another area and commit that same violation all over again. So in that regard, the most fundamental ambitions were quite humble, and all this big data has only come afterwards. But you can imagine that as long as data sharing systems are not working effectively, as long as shared data ecosystems and standards have not been set up, you cannot even start to begin thinking about big data, AI, or social credit scores. And there's quite a lot of indication that really, like, social credit scores are not the way forward, even if we may think that is something. But the caveat, or kind of the flip side of this flexible, of this low-tech nature of social credit, is that it's adaptable. So it can be very quickly adapted to new policy areas, to new policy priorities. And this also happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, where within just a matter of weeks, a whole slew of regulations was released to clamp down on all of these restrictions that were imposed during the lockdowns. And then to use the incentives and this propaganda almost like tool of the social credit system to then also facilitate the orderly return to the workplace. But really, what does this then mean for businesses, foreigners, and so forth? Well, in some ways you can ask, is the social credit system a whole lot of fuss about nothing? And to some extent, of course, it is. If you look at the percentages of people affected, you're talking about maybe 0.1, 0.2% of citizens. Compare this to the prison rates in the US, and you'll find that it's a really small percentage. Businesses are affected to a greater degree, but even there we see it's a relatively small percentage. But nevertheless, social credit is really going to be and remain a defining feature of governance in China, simply because it offers tools to enforce regulations more strictly, to share data across these different before closed infrastructures. But what's really important to note is that it's really only one part of the puzzle. So it was already illustrated, you're not going to find the surveillance state in the social credit system. Social credit system has its own role, and it will be complemented with a lot more blunter tools if you want to enforce political security. And some of the risks that we see then right now are also ironically related not to this high-tech nature of the system, but to its very low-tech and human-driven nature. So imagine that if there are no standardized practices, then it also leads to over-implementation. There can be vectors for corruption, for abuse of power. The fragmentation also means that what is really strictly enforced in one area may be kind of ignored in other cities, or vice versa, and that can land you on a blacklist if you do not pay attention. Although, of course, to land on a blacklist, the violation has to be quite severe. So you'll probably know what you're doing wrong in that case. And also lastly, because these information systems are not as well developed, there have been instances, especially in kind of 2016, 2017, of people landing on the blacklist without being aware of that themselves. And then how do you get off that blacklist? This whole process of credits repair that was already alluded to by Dai, that's also for now a relatively opaque process. Although a recent draft has just been published for what may be to come in that regard. So lastly, in a couple minutes, what is the way forward? Well, I think positively speaking, the State Council, so China's cabinet, is quite well aware that these challenges exist. And it is definitely looking to address these step by step. So we see steps to more clearly define, okay, what is social credit? How can we use it? What can be legal grounds to land someone on a blacklist? So indeed, as was previously already mentioned, this is really increasingly confined to only violations of pre-existing legal obligations or violations of administrative procedures. We are seeing some very early safeguards against AI-based decision-making. It appears that the authorities are very well aware that AI, it can be 99% accurate, but on a country the size of China, that is going to result in a lot of mistakes. And there appears to be a level of awareness that that is not something that you would like to introduce for market regulation and for most of Chinese citizens that are well behaved. And we also see increased concerns with things like individual data protection, concerns with proportionality of the social credit system, because as was already mentioned, some of these blacklists really have teeth. And some people may land on blacklists for very small violations, whereas others may land on blacklists for very severe violations. So they're turning that into a more layered system to make it a little bit more fair. We, of course, see the standardization of procedures. So standardizing information, information transmission to companies, to individuals, to let them know when they land on the blacklist and what they can do to get off that blacklist more effectively. And lastly, of course, really one of the key points that you see pop up in almost all documents is improving these data sharing mechanisms, because that is really what ties the social credit system together. And there's a lot of progress that still needs to be made in that regard. To conclude, I would, however, say that this is not going to be a process that can just be rolled out quickly over a term of a year. We often have this imagination, and coming back to some of the fanfic, that Xi Jinping is in complete control of the entire bureaucracy in China, and that if Xi Jinping decrees something, that the entire bureaucracy mobilizes to get something to work. But as was already illustrated before, many of these agencies don't like to work together. They may have their own interests. They may not want to cooperate. And if you then imagine that the social credit system has already been in the works since, let's say, the early 2000s, it's taken 2 decades to get to this here, and there are still a lot of kinks to iron out. When you then imagine this enormous complex bureaucracy, the complexity and very much all-encompassing scope of the social credit system, it involves 40 different ministries, and that is mirrored at provincial and municipal level. Building a technical architecture is really not the problem, or that will cause the social credit system to take a long time. But what is difficult is getting all of these actors aligned to make good use of these technical architectures, to use them according to the way that the State Council and central authorities want them to. And getting all those noses pointing in a direction, that is really going to take years, if not maybe a decade or more. So this idea that from 2014 to 2020 and full implementation of social credit system, that's just not going to be. And yeah, I would like to leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincent, for your presentation. I think between the three of you, we all have a much better understanding of the social credit system than we did when we started. So I appreciate that. We're going to jump into questions now. The first one that we have from our audience is about the role of technology in the social credit system. And that seems to be one of the most pervasive myths, is that there's some invisible AI algorithm that's weeding through these mountains of data and spitting out blacklists or social credit scores or whatnot. So just what is the actual role of technology, in particular AI, in the social credit system as it is now, and perhaps as it's envisioned in the future? Jeremy, did you want to tackle that?
Sorry, always finding the mute button is my technical challenge. Technology, a lot of the mythos began because of Sesame Credit, which was a private company authorized under the financial portion of social credit to try and use some of the massive data they had from the Alibaba industry to create some sort of financial credit score. That system was never approved and sort of criticized roundly because one, the data, the score they were generating wasn't useful for predicting someone's financial credit, which is the ability and likelihood of their repaying loans. But also because it was a conflict of interest. They were basing it on how many purchases you made through their products largely and what you purchased. The reason I say it began there is because their spokespeople put forward the idea that they were creating an innovative new way of assessing a person's trustworthiness. They sort of misunderstood their mission. They were supposed to be doing a credit report and they talked it up past that. In fact, the program in its end form, I've described as a loyalty rewards program with amazing swagger. Basically, you get some benefits in their company and a few other companies, like waiving security deposits on rentals in exchange for having been a consistent purchaser. There were small loans, but at the credit card sort of level, but it wasn't consequential to most people. But I want to say that when I talk about social credit in China, I always make it clear what I'm talking about is this one social credit system. The use of technology in China is a big topic, bigger than social credit and of great importance to the Chinese people and to the world. China is making a lot of efforts right now to create standards and rules for the use of these new technologies. This includes the recent data security law. It includes the upcoming personal information protection law. People are concerned about the use of facial recognition technology. People are concerned about what information apps are collecting. And China's put out detailed rules for what information apps can collect without specific permissions beyond just your blanket consent. So these are big issues that can be looked at carefully. But they really do go beyond social credit. I would like, if I may, to make one quick comment about the messiness of social credit, which Vincent was touching on, because it is a complicated system. But I think, in truth, social credit isn't what makes it complicated. It's the law that's complicated. Regulatory law is the jungle, not social credit. Social credit is probably best thought of as a user interface overlaid on top of this administrative regulatory system. So this is a nice way of visualizing it and of communicating with the public about, or with the businesses that are being regulated, but it's the underlying laws that are messy. Anyone who's ever had a legal dispute in their personal lives or business lives knows how difficult it can be. But we're seeing, here's this tension between the fanfic and the reality. There's a lot of these issues in the administrative regulatory system we'd love to get into talking about. The details of credit restoration, the details of notification of blacklist inclusion. And the three of us could probably go for hours. The truth is, most of our audience probably tuned in to hear about how AI is rating citizens in China and tuned out the minute we said that wasn't the case. And trying to address both of those audiences at the same time is really very difficult.
Okay, did any of our other panelists want to weigh in on the issue of tech? Xin?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you go first.
Sure, thanks. No, I'll be very brief. So first, in terms of AI, I always ask, please first define AI for me, right? So if you're talking about algorithms, yes, I mean, credit scoring, the traditional credit scoring, the score comes out from an algorithm, right? So, there are, for example, I said some local governments, cities, that they might trying to set up some kinds of, local individual citizen score, as I said, right? But yeah, when they do the score, they might have some kind of algorithm. But they don't sound like AI to me, right? So especially I'm pretty sure there's no machine learning involved at all, right? So those are basically rule-based algorithms, not a dynamic kind of machine learning stuff. In terms of if people want to ask about, for example, facial recognition, whether those data might come into the social credit system. So some of the recent, so first they don't, and also just to make this clear, some of the relatively recent provincial social credit system regulation have made it even clearer, explicitly in the regulation, saying, look, the bioinformation, including facial recognition data, are excluded from the scope of credit information, public credit information. So you don't, that they basically, law says agencies and also the commercial entities especially, they are prohibited from collecting those data for the purpose of making them credit related.
Vincent, did you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, and again, I think this is where this differentiation comes in. If you want to look for scary examples of big data, AI use in China, you'll find it. But that's not, I think, what they're interested in applying to 95% of the population. Again, because there's this risk that if you start applying these things that may work in a wonky way, or that may have a small error rate, then that's going to result in a lot of controversy. And sometimes you see some of these small controversies pop up surrounding the social credit system as well, when some rules have been applied in an ambiguous way. So this awareness that this is not something to be applied to the vast majority of population is just there. And instead, indeed, most of the digitization that we see in social credit systems is either data sharing systems or glorified Excel sheets. That doesn't mean that it's not impactful, because glorified Excel sheets with data from the entirety of China can matter a lot. But it's just not this super scary dystopian picture.
Our next question is about corruption in the social credit system. Are there safeguards to guard against corruption? And is there potential for the social credit system to make this business regulation more transparent, or could it go the other way and exacerbate corruption by making things less transparent? I don't know which one of our panelists wants to take a crack at this first. Any volunteers?
I mentioned the corruption, so maybe I can take this. So one of the safeguards, theoretically speaking, is that the social credit system can be turned against local government authorities if they misbehave. So if local authorities prove to be untrustworthy, their department and the leaders of that department can be put on the blacklist. And technically speaking, really, the social credit system is supposed to make business regulation more transparent. But as it is an extension of the Chinese legal system and also primarily run by humans, you cannot rule out that there are these factors for personal influence and the steering of certain local regulations and whatnot. So yes, technically it's supposed to make it more fair, more transparent, more egalitarian. But that's not necessarily the case in all practices.
I'll chime in just briefly that, yeah, as Vincent was saying, I agree. Corruption is a real problem in China. I would say perception of corruption is an even bigger problem. There's the belief that corruption is going to undermine everything, and that has its impact on business and personal interactions. It is an extension of the law, and the law is currently trying very hard to crack down on corruption, sometimes through methods that I find more frightening than anything in the social credit system, including the creation of a supervision commission that is largely extrajudicial and has the ability to punish officials. What I wanted to add mainly, though, was something that Dai pointed out earlier, which is that social credit in terms of regulation is actually viewed as supposed to be reducing the administrative burden on corporations. It's part of a larger reform of decentralization, where instead of having oppressive pre-transaction, pre-establishment of corporation burdens, administrative burdens like registration processes, approvals, permits, you're allowed now to on credit, and they use that term loosely again, but by making a pledge that you're going to follow the laws and comply with all requirements, so that you promise you'll have every safety system in place. That would be seen as a form of credit pledge, that you promise you're going to get all the systems you're required to, and thus don't have to have inspections, but they'll regulate you once you're in business to make it easier for business to get going. I think that's something that's often missed with the discussion of social credit. But again, it's largely an interface with the law. So where the law has room for corruption, which unfortunately, is still many places. Corruption is going to be possible, but I don't think social credit would add to it in any way.
Yeah. Well, just to add, also, I think that relates to one of the questions. I think down the screen. So basically, so yes, what the law and regulations are already pretty complicated, and then you add one extra layer, which is social credit, related regulations and sanctions, for example, and awards. That indeed makes things even more complex. That actually, so I agree with both Jeremy and Vincent. This is indeed just to try to make things more transparent, because now you want everything to be on record, and also there's going to be a lot of disclosure, right? So that things could be more transparent. But then, so it seems for the business that now you need to consult more, kind of regular requirements in addition to what's already existing, and you also need to look for other kind of things that might actually apply to you. So and you worry you might actually miss something because that's less transparent. So I think that kind of concern is heard by the regulators. So that's why I think last year there has been this very major document issued by the State Council requiring all credit-based regulation to comply with, for example, all kinds of rule of law principles, including transparency, right? So the idea is now the regulator, especially the NDRC, they need to work out all kinds of checklists and keep updating them, the checklist for the information that will be included in the scope of public credit information, and also what kind of the checklist of all kind of sanctions that could be linked to these kind of credit information, just so as to increase the transparency, also to reduce the kind of risk of corruption or the kind of abuse of power by local officials running these systems.
Our next question is specifically about the role of environmental regulations in social credit scores, presumably for companies. I'm going to expand it a little bit, because I think what makes this system scary to Western observers, at least, is the social part of it, right? Like if you just talk about credit systems in the financial sense, that's very much par for the course. I think every country in the world has some sort of system on that, but it's the social idea. It's the idea that, again, according to the fanfic, I like that term, Jeremy, that you jaywalked one too many times and now you can't buy a plane ticket anymore. That somehow your actions in society are going to impact your financial life. So environmental regulations, maybe workplace safety violations, what aspects other than the pure financial thing are impacting the social credit system and being fed into these databases?
Yeah, okay, good. So we can take a step back there, because again, we're going to have to separate the financial component from the regulatory components. They're not merged. So it's not in addition to. And in fact, within the administrative regulatory system, what's primarily happening is that, as in any country, each agency is regulating its own little domain, right? The Food and Drug Safety people are looking at food and drugs. The universality comes of it with these blacklists. And that's when you've committed a violation that's so severe. It's not just a normal violation of the laws in an area, but is something that endangers the public safety, that makes you more generally untrustworthy. We have similar concepts sometimes in foreign law of certain crimes of fraud might be considered later in other contexts. When you apply for a loan, say a conviction for fraud is different than a conviction for something else. There inherently speaks to your trustworthiness. So every violation of law, environmental and whatnot, anything that gets regulated could be a part of social credit. As we've been discussing, there are actually some limits where not everything goes in, but it could be. So they're creating catalogs that tell you what will be included. So cities will put out a catalog of what's called public credit information. And this public credit information is information created by government agencies that will be recorded, but it's not being integrated, it's being centralized. So this information is being generally brought into one place where it can be found, but it's not being mixed up into some magic score. And if you think about it, the idea of a magic score doesn't really make much sense, right? When you go into a restaurant in whatever country you happen to be in, there's often a grade outside that restaurant about the sanitation level that the restaurant inspector put there. You want to know that that grade reflects something meaningful to you, the cleanliness of the food and the sanitation of this restaurant, right? If I see a C, I want to know, oh, this is a dirty restaurant. If I see an A, New York system, A, B, C, I want to know this is a good, clean restaurant. If you integrate all the data, what you're doing is you're taking big data and making it small again. You're making it so I can't get useful information. So if I go to the restaurant and the guy actually had horrible health violations, 3 people were food poisoned by the soup in 1 week, but he visits his grandma a lot and he gave to charity, so he's getting an A. That's not going to help me. That's going to hurt me. You're hiding the relevant information. So these agencies generally want their information to be clear because different organizations want different information. The banks want to know who's safe to lend to, right? And any information that's useful to that, they might try and incorporate, but that's the data they're looking for. And they don't want it obfuscated, they want it clarified. So I think it's important to keep that clear. But yeah, environmental regulations are absolutely there because there's environmental regulators. And any area where there's administrative law is likely to have some consequences. I actually created a tool on my website that lets you see how a lot of these MOUs interact. You can choose the enforcing agency and the area of law that you're interested in and see what other agencies will enact punishments based on blacklisting by in one area. And a final thought, I'm sorry to ramble on, but I think a lot of the problem comes from the term social credit, which is a confusing term in Chinese too, but is even worse when it comes to English. Because the use of social here, like you said, implies some evaluation of you as a social actor rather than a business actor or a legal actor. And the truth is, sometimes this could almost be called a mistranslation. For example, what would literally be using the same word, social capital, which in English we already use to mean sort of your prestige points that you can spend with other people, your political capital. In China, what would literally be translated as social capital just means public funds. So this is really about public credit, right? This is about the idea that it is credit coming from public sources. But I think that even the term credit here is confusing. And I've heard Chinese scholars argue the same, that really the non-financial part shouldn't be called credit. We're so used to our use of the word credit, we forget how broad a term that is in English as well. Is he credible? You got to give him credit for that. It is a beyond money term, but I think that a lot of the issue is terminology. And that's part of why it gets exciting. We had the fantasies about rating people in fiction long before China had this social credit system. We just didn't have a good word for what that fantasy was. And social credit does really ring nicely with it in English.
Hey, Xin or Vincent, did either of you want to chime in on the sort of non-financial components? Yeah, Xin.
Yeah, not much to add. Actually, I totally agree with what Jeremy said. Actually, conceptually, you think you might actually be able to link all these things together and then to evaluate the person as a whole. But then, everybody, in practice, they would realize how hard that is, right? So, for example, we do see, like sometimes, especially in earlier years, in some very local community or local government, they might try to set up like a points program saying, look, all kinds of these might actually be coming into the calculus of a score, or at least of evaluation that might be ranked, right? For example, all grades. And then, this grade can be used for multiple purposes, not just one purpose. But then, once they realize, that kind of thing is first very hard to design, right? You can really, there you might actually need to have some very sophisticated algorithm, which people don't have. And then also, so if you really tie very kind of substantive, rewards or sanctions to these kind of scores, then, obviously there are going to be very bad publicity and also negative reactions, which typically government officials in China, that's usually the last thing they want when they are trying to do something they thought is reformative or creative. So honestly, we have been, speaking to journalists all the time. Every time people ask about this, we say, look, that sounds to be an ideal that might actually make sense, but in reality, it's really too hard to put together. So, really, you don't see them.
We've had several of the panelists bring up this idea of backlash from within China, and I want to focus on that a little bit for our final question. To what extent is the response, the public response from Chinese people, whether that's the general public or academia or companies themselves, helping to shape the way the social credit system evolves? Because in other fields, we've seen examples of a government rolls out a policy and the backlash is pretty severe and they walk it back. So how is that sort of interplay between public and the regulation helping to shape the social credit system's future? And well, you can continue. Okay.
Yeah, sure. I would just start with some very brief, observation. I think, at least in recent 3-4 years or 2-3 years. So the government, especially the agency that are responsible for the design, also the implementation of the social credit system, they are really they really care about, for example, what kind of feedback they get from not only the general public but also the business community, right? So they want to make sure whatever they do are not super controversial, but also are useful in terms of dealing with all these kind of regulatory problems, especially financial frauds, consumer fraud, all these kind of bad things, right? So I think their standpoint is, first, they understand that the society, most people actually hate frauds, right? So they don't like bad and unsafe products. They think, they're definitely going to be some agency come out to deal with them. And then the agency think, okay, we have this tool we think will be useful. And indeed, most people support them. But then, when it comes to very specific applications, sometimes, especially the local pilots, that might actually, for just in their promotion material, they say something, describe something really weird, and then you will have the backlash. And then, typically, so that's the local governments, and then you will have the pressure from upside down, right? Basically say, look, you guys need to be more careful not doing this. And also all the standardization effort happening in recent couple of years, engineered by the State Council and also the NDRC, they're really just saying, look, we see all these things you're trying out. We think that those are too controversial. That's why we want to impose all these kind of national standards, so you don't do the stuff that making people unhappy, right? So I think that's the kind of dynamic going on, and that's why now increasingly, I think, as Jeremy has mentioned earlier, there are all these kind of limitations imposed on what kind of data comes into the system, what kind of ramifications or administrative actions can be linked to this information, and go so on and so forth.
Vincent, did you want to chime in on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can give a very concrete example of when this kind of steering and adjusting after the fact happened. In China, there were quite a couple of examples of people like whose parents, for instance, were not able to repay their loans or refused to repay their loans, ended up on this court defaulter blacklist. And then the children themselves were not able to attend schools. Like, legally speaking, originally the idea was you're only not allowed to attend these high-paying schools, the private schools. But at some point, some schools started also excluding just the regular kids or from the regular schools. And so at some point, these controversies became very public. And that then also triggered, I'm not sure if it was either the NDRC or the State Council, to say, okay, these blacklists, they may not interfere on the legal rights of citizens, and especially not their children or not. So that's really one very small example where quite a big controversy led to some very minor adjustments. And I think you see that all the time, like these very little things that then, oh, okay, well, this is perhaps not the direction we want to go in. It's resulting in some unrest. And then, okay, we should add some extra clauses to our next document and so on.
Sorry, Shannon, with that example, because this is actually the kind of thing that I keep talking about. So I respectfully disagree with what Vincent just said. I mean, in terms of the example, right? So there has been, spreading all the time, every year, basically, especially when it comes to this time when students are actually applying for, colleges, saying, look, there are these kind of instances where children of these people who have, failed to, fulfill their court decisions are denied education, even not in compliance with whatever rules. So first, the rules has never, as Vincent actually correctly mentioned, the rule is only that children of these people who have been delinquent will not be allowed to enroll in the expensive private school. So that has been always the rule. And second, actually, we have not seen any single case where in fact, indeed, there is a child who has been denied entrance to public school because of even the abuse or mistaken understanding of the rule by local official. There has been these kind of stories, but I don't think any of them has been validated at this point. So but also that's why. So so there has been this clarification issued by the officials, by, for example, NPC spokesperson or NDRC spokesperson, saying, look, there has been this saying going on, but we are going to make this very clear that has never been the rule. Children can. The only restriction is for children not to enroll into expensive private schools.
All right, we're just at time. I don't know, Jeremy, if you wanted to chime in on this topic or just let it be.
I would only add the note on misinformation, because I think this is touching on the domestic misinformation. And we tend to portray China, including even its citizens and its government, as a monolith. But almost every of the social credit stories that have outraged people in China, I find when you probe a little further, as someone with a legal background, you see that they're actually being misreported within China. But most interesting, I find, what we heard earlier, that even some Chinese academics are writing reports about the score. And I'm reading our comments with people, citing a Vice report, which is very confusing if you watch it and don't fully understand what's the background is. And I think the one thing that we have to remember is that our misinformation on social credit has actually infiltrated China. And I'm sure that those papers that you're reading by Chinese academics are citing foreign academics writing about an imaginary system. And like I said, to me, this is the most interesting dystopian story, is watching this circle where now people are believing what's being said beyond what they know with their own hearts and eyes and ears. And it really is a fascinating story. There's been some great books even. There's a great book called Like Wars, fantastic, about the current social media involvement and impact on our real life. But when it touches social credit, it very ironically cites the fanfic. So we have experts on misinformation being misinformed by this story. And I think, to me, this is the real story here. Even in an hour long where we've gone into great depth on social credit issues, that a lot of our audience, every time we say social credit, is picturing an all-seeing algorithmic God spitting out scores, and it's going to result in more confusion. I urge people to look at some of the original source documents. We've translated many, as have others, and you'll see that it actually just doesn't align with what's out there.
All right, and that's a great note to end on, Jeremy. Thank you, because it brings us full circle to the original purpose of this webinar, which is helping us separate out the fact and the fiction. And there's a lot of fiction on the social credit system. I think that we were greatly successful. As Jeremy said earlier, we could talk for hours about this topic, but I appreciate your time here today, panelists. Thank you very much for joining us and helping us make sense of a very complicated issue. So
thank you.
And thank you to all our attendees as well. And we'll see you at the next webinar.